The shelter was quiet that evening, the soft hum of fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor cages lined the walls filled with animals, waiting for a second chance, a home, a family, something better among the usual. Hum of activity, the shelter's most vocal resident, a brightly colored parrot named Rio, sat on his perch, feathers ruffled. Staring blankly ahead, his cage was in the corner away from the dogs and cats, a place meant to give him some peace, but peace had never come for Rio for months. Rio had been crying, not just chirping or squawking like any other bird, but a heart-wrenching, keening cry that echoed through the shelter. It started the moment he arrived, and no one could figure out why. The shelter staff, who prided themselves on their ability to help even the most traumatized animals, were at a loss. They had seen birds come in fearful, aggressive, or injured, but none like Rio. His mournful cry pierced their heart. But despite every effort to calm him, to soothe him, nothing worked at first. They thought it was the stress of being abandoned. Rio had been brought to the shelter after his previous owner passed away suddenly. He'd lived in a small, cluttered apartment, his cage set beside a window where he could look out over the street below. When the paramedics found the old man, R was still chirping, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding before him. He was brought to the shelter in a state of confusion, and the crying began almost immediately. He must miss his owner, the shelter worker said. He's mourning. It made sense, at least for the first few weeks. Parrots are highly intelligent and emotional creatures capable of deep bonds with their humans. Rio had likely been very close to the man who had passed away, but as the weeks turned into months, the crying never stopped. In fact, it only grew louder, more frantic. The Alter's head vet, Dr. Jessica Morgan, had spent countless hours trying to figure out what was wrong with Rio. She checked him for injuries, examined his diet, even adjusted the lighting in his cage to see if that might help. She tried everything, but there was no physical cause for his distress. He's healthy, she told the shelter director, Michael. I don't understand it. There's no reason for him to be this upset. I've never seen anything like it, Michael replied, running a hand through his thin hair. Maybe it's psychological, some kind of trauma. Dr. Jessica Morgan stood in the shelter's examination room, her mind racing. She leaned against the counter, watching Rio from across the room. His colorful feathers, green, red, and blue, stood in stark contrast to the bleakness of the metal cage. Despite his beauty, he sat there hunched over, motionless, except for the low, mournful cry that emanated from him like clockwork. It was unlike any sound she'd ever heard from a bird, a hollow, aching wail that echoed off the walls and into her thoughts long after her shifts were over. Jessica had been the head vet at the shelter for over 10 years. She dealt with animals who had been abused, neglected, or abandoned, but Rio had stumped her. There was no logical explanation for his relentless cries. He was physically healthy. His plumage was vibrant, his appetite normal, and his wings and talons in condition. Despite all outward appearances, though, something was deeply wrong. Michael, the shelter director, walked in, his eyes weary from hearing Rio's cries for another night. Jess, he said quietly, this bird's breaking my heart. Is there anything else we can do? She sighed. I've tried everything I can think of. There's no injury, no illness. I don't know if it's something deeper, psychological. Maybe it's as if he's in mourning, but it's been months. Michael nodded and approached the cage cautiously, as if not to disturb Rio too much. He reached a hand out, but the parrot didn't react. No flinch, no acknowledgement, just more of that agonizing cry. Do we know anything about his previous owner? Jessica glanced at the intake file on the counter. His last owner was an older man, lived alone. Paramedics found Rio in the apartment after the man died. They said the bird seemed normal at first, chirping even, but once he got here, well, you know the rest. Michael rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. It's been 5 months, Jess, 5 long months. We've had some tough cases here, but nothing like this. I mean, if this keeps up, he might never be adoptable. The words stung Jessica. She had taken it upon herself to give every animal in the shelter the best possible chance for a new life, and the idea that Rio might never escape the confines of his cage felt like a personal Failure, maybe there's something we missed, she said, her voice determined. Michael gave her a skeptical look. Missed? What you've done, every test, every exam? No, Jessica replied, but I want to try something different. That night, after the shelter had closed and the other animals were resting, Jessica decided to spend more one-on-one time with Rio. She brought a folding chair over to his cage and sat quietly watching him. She didn't try to touch him or speak, just sat in silence. The crying continued, but Jessica noticed something subtle in his voice, a rhythm, almost like a pattern. She recorded the sound on her phone and played it back. The crying was more than just random noise. It had a cadence to it, almost like language. Just Jessica had worked with parrots before and knew that many could mimic human speech, but Rio wasn't mimicking. This sounded different. The next morning, she brought the recording to a friend of hers, Dr. Ethan Reynolds, a specialist in animal behavior. It's not normal, she said, handing him her phone. Ethan listened to the recording, his brow furrowing. You're right, this isn't typical. It's repetitive, almost like he's trying to communicate something, but it's not like any word I've heard from a parrot, Jessica said. Ethan nodded, intrigued. I don't think he's mimicking, he's reliving something, repeating something over and over. It could be linked to trauma. Jessica's mind raced. Trauma, like from losing his owner, maybe, Ethan said. But his voice wasn't convinced. Or it could be something more. Sometimes animals get stuck in a loop, repeating the same behavior as a response to a specific trigger. Just Jessica thought for a moment, her eyes narrowing. What if something happened before his owner died? Something that we're not aware of. Could he be trying to tell us? Ethan leaned back in his chair. It's possible, but figuring out what that is, well, that's going to be difficult. Determined, Jessica returned to the shelter with a new sense of purpose. That evening, she sat by Rio's cage again, listening to the crying, trying to find meaning in the sound. As she sat there, exhausted from trying to crack the puzzle, she noticed something on the bottom of the cage, a small object half buried beneath the newspaper lining. Curious, she reached in and gently pulled it out. It was an old faded key, a simple brass key, unremarkable except for the fact that it was completely out of place in Rio's cage. Jessica held it up, studying it. How long had it been there? And more importantly, what was it doing in the parrot's cage? Her pulse quickened. Could this be a clue, something that Rio had clung to after his owner's death? She wondered if the key might unlock more than just a door. Maybe it would unlock the mystery behind Rio's cries. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the key was important. She decided to investigate further. The next day, she visited the apartment building where Rio's previous owner had lived. The building manager, a gruff older man, wasn't particularly interested in helping, but when Jessica mentioned the key, his eyes lit up with recognition. That old man had a storage unit in the basement. He said he kept it locked all the time, never let anyone inside. Jessica's heart raced. Do you still have access to it? The manager shrugged. I suppose we've been meaning to clear it out since he passed, but we never got around to it. They made their way to the basement, and the manager led her to a dusty, forgotten corner of the building. Sure enough, there was a small rusted door with a padlock. Jessica slid the key into the lock, her hands trembling slightly. With a click, the lock popped open and the door creaked as she pushed it open. The storage unit was dark and musty, filled with boxes and old furniture. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special, but as Jessica moved further inside, she spotted a small bird-sized perch in the corner to the one in the apartment. Then her eyes landed on a large framed photograph sitting atop a dusty table. It was a picture of the old man Rio perched on his shoulder and another parrot beside him, a second parrot identical in color and markings to Rio. Her mind reeled. Rio hadn't been the old man's only companion. There had been another bird, but where was it? What had happened to it? Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. Rio's Cries they weren't just mournful calls of grief, they were a desperate plea, a call for the missing parrot, his lifelong companion. Rio hadn't just lost his owner. He had lost his mate. Jessica rushed back to the shelter, her heart pounding. Could it be possible that the second parrot was still out there somewhere? Had it been separated from Rio in the chaos following the old man's death? It seemed improbable, but the possibility gnawed at her. She immediately contacted local bird rescues, scanning through records and posting, searching for any sign of the missing bird. Her days passed, and just when she was about to lose hope, she received an email from a small rescue 2 towns over. They had recently taken in a parrot matching the description, a bird found wandering the streets, malnourished and distressed. Jessica wasted no time. She drove to the rescue, her hands shaking with anticipation. When she arrived, the staff led her to the parrot, and the moment she saw the bird, she knew it was Rio's mate, the missing piece of the puzzle. With trembling hands, Jessica brought the parrot back to the shelter. She had no idea how Rio would react, whether he would even remember his companion after so much time apart. But as she approached Rio's cage with the second bird, something incredible happened. Rio, who had been crying endlessly for months, suddenly fell silent. His eyes, once dull with sadness, lit up with recognition. He hopped to the edge of his perch, his wings fluttering slightly, and let out a soft, almost questioning chirp. The second parrot responded with a similar call, and Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. The 2 birds were communicating, their voices mingling in a way that was impossible to. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. The 2 birds were communicating, their voices mingling in a way that was impossible to misunderstand. After months of sorrow and confusion, Rio had found what he had been searching for: his companion, his family. Tears filled Jessica's eyes as she watched the 2 parrots reunite, their calls blending together in a harmony that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The mystery had been solved, and in the end it wasn't just Rio who had been crying for months. It had been a cry for love, for connection, for the one thing he thought he had lost forever. Jessica opened the cage and gently placed the second parrot inside. The 2 birds immediately pressed their heads together, an unmistakable gesture of affection. For the first time since he'd arrived at the shelter, Rio was quiet, peaceful. The months of crying, the relentless heartache, it was all over. Jessica smiled, her heart full, as she watched the birds settle into each other's company. Jessica stood there, her breath caught in her chest as she watched the 2 parrots settle in together. Rio's transformation was almost immediate. His once frantic movements were now calm. His feathers, that had been constantly ruffled due to stress, now sleek and smooth. The cries that had haunted the shelter for months were replaced by soft, almost melodic chirps. It was like witnessing a miracle unfold. Rio, once a symbol of heartbreak and confusion, now stood proud and at ease, his eyes bright as he nuzzled against his companion. The change was profound, and Jessica could feel the weight of all those sleepless nights and long days of unanswered questions lifting from her shoulders. It was clear now Rio hadn't been mourning his owner, at least not entirely. He had been crying out for his missing mate, the one he had been separated from. When his world was turned upside down, Jessica's hand trembled slightly as she closed the cage door behind the 2 birds, not wanting to disturb their reunion. She took a deep breath and stepped back, allowing them the space they needed after so much time apart. Michael walked into the room, his usual stern expression softening as he saw the 2 parrots together. Is that Jessica nodded, her eyes still locked on the birds. That's Rio's mate. I found her at a rescue a couple of towns over. I don't know how they got separated, but it doesn't matter. Now they're together again. Michael looked stunned. I never would have guessed. All this time we thought he was mourning the old man, but He was calling for her. I should have realized it sooner, Jessica said, her voice thick with emotion the way he cried. It wasn't just grief, it was a call for something more. And Michael leaned against the counter, shaking his head in disbelief. And now, Jessica said, a soft smile playing on her lips. He's quiet. I think he's finally at peace. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They both stood in awe of the scene unfolding before them. Two birds, one separated by tragedy, now reunited. It was as if the entire shelter breathed a collective sigh of relief. The relentless, sorrowful cries that had filled the halls for months were gone, replaced by the soothing hum of contentment. But there was something else stirring in Jessica's mind, a lingering question that wouldn't let go. Why had Rio's cries sounded so desperate, so uniquely heart-wrenching, as if something terrible had happened? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than just the separation. The following days were filled with joy. The shelter, Rio and his mate, whom Jessica had decided to name Maya, quickly became the stars of the shelter. Their bond was undeniable, and their presence seemed to lift the spirits of everyone around them. Jessica's heart swelled every time she saw the two birds chirping softly to one another, pining each other's feathers, or simply resting side by side in their shared cage. But something kept nagging at her. The key, the storage unit, the old man's apartment. It all felt too coincidental. And then, as if the universe was answering her silent questions, a piece of information arrived that shook her to the core. One morning, Jessica received a call from a woman claiming to social media post about Rio and Maya's reunion and wanted to know if they were okay. As they spoke, Jessica mentioned the key in the storage unit, hoping to learn more about the old man's life and perhaps cover more of Rio and Maya's story. The niece's voice dropped, her tone shifting from casual curiosity to something much darker. You found the key to the storage unit? Yes, Jessica said, her pulse quickening. Why was there something important in there? The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if this will make sense, but my uncle wasn't just keeping things in that storage unit. There was something valuable he had hidden away. And I don't mean money or jewelry. Jessica's heart began to race. What do you mean? The niece paused before continuing. He was involved in something strange, something I never fully understood. He used to breed exotic birds, rare ones. There were rumors that he was part of an underground trade, smuggling endangered species. He kept his two favorites, Rio and hidden, but after my uncle died, I found out that someone had been looking for those birds, someone dangerous. Jessica's mind whirled. She thought back to the storage unit, the hidden perch, the strange photograph of the two birds together. Are you saying Rio and Maya were part of some illegal operation? I don't know for sure, the woman said, her voice tinged with regret, but I think someone wanted those birds. My uncle, he was protective of them. He loved them, but he also knew they were valuable, more valuable than anyone realized. A chill ran down Jessica's spine. Suddenly, the cries that had echoed through the shelter made sense. Rio hadn't just been crying for his lost mate. He had been terrified, calling out in fear, perhaps remembering the people who had come for him and Maya. Had someone tried to steal them? Had the old man died protecting them? Do you think someone was after them? Jessica asked, her voice trembling. It's possible, the woman replied. I've tried to piece it all together since he passed, but I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. Just be careful. If those birds are as valuable as I think they are, someone might still be looking for them. Jessica hung up the phone, her thoughts spinning, she looked over at Rio and Maya, who were now peacefully perched, together completely unaware of the storm. Brewing around them she couldn't ignore, the feeling of danger that now hung in the air if what the niece said was true. Rio and Maya weren't just shelter birds. They were coveted, possibly even endangered, and if someone had tried to take them before they might try. Again, the next few days, Jessica made sure to keep a close eye on the birds. She tightened security at the shelter, instructed the staff to be extra vigilant, and even considered moving Rio and Maya to a more secure location. But as the days passed and nothing unusual happened, she began to relax, hoping that perhaps the danger had passed with the old man's death. Then late one night, the shelter's alarm went off. Jessica, who lived only 10 minutes away, received the call immediately. She threw on a jacket and rushed to her car, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of someone breaking into the shelter sent waves of panic through her, and she couldn't help but think of Rio and Maya. When she arrived, police cars were already outside, their lights flashing in the darkness. Jessica pushed her way through the officers and ran inside, her mind racing with fear. Michael was there, pacing nervously. Someone broke in, he said. Breathlessly, they tried to get to the birds. Jessica's blood ran cold. Rio and Maya, are they okay? Michael nodded. They're fine. Whoever it was couldn't get into the cage in time. The alarm scared them off. Jessica rushed to the aviary. Rio and Maya were huddled together, their feathers fluffed up in fear, but they were unharmed. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a cold realization someone had come for them. As the police dusted for fingerprints and took statements, Jessica stood in front of the aviary watching Rio and Maya. They had been through so much already, and now they were in danger once again, but Jessica wasn't about to let them go. Without a fight, she contacted the authorities, providing them with the information the old man's niece had given her, and worked to find a safe sanctuary for Rio and Maya, a place where they would be protected, where no one could ever harm them again. In the end, the birds were transferred to a wildlife sanctuary specializing in endangered species far away from the shelter and anyone who might be looking for them. It was bittersweet for Jessica to say goodbye, but she knew it was for the best. Rio and Maya would be safe, free to live out the rest of their days in peace together, just as they were meant to be. As she watched the two parrots fly off into the trees at their new sanctuary, Jessica smiled, her heart full of both sorrow and joy. Rio's cries had led her on a journey she never could have imagined, but in the end he had found what he needed: a home, a family, and above all safety. And Jessica knew deep down that she had done right by them. As Jessica stood in the sanctuary, watching Rio and Maya disappear into the canopy of trees, a wave of peace settled over her. The birds, once trapped in a world of anxiety and fear, had finally found their freedom. It felt like the ending to a chapter that had begun in sorrow and uncertainty, but had transformed into something